on what is, in Poznan at least, a very sunny Sunday morning. So this is the fourth and final plenary lecture of YLMP 2021. And today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Julien Perrez, who is a professor of linguistics at the University of Liège, Department of Modern Languages. He is active in the fields of cognitive linguistics, political discourse studies, and Dutch linguistics. And his research has focused on metaphor variation in political discourse, including in political debates, on citizen discourse in the context of Belgian federalism, and the use of metaphors by politicians in a historical perspective. Julien has established a partnership with the political scientist Min Rochon, with whom he founded the research group Langue et Politique, gathering 70 Belgian and international scholars from a broad range of disciplines, who are all interested in the interactions between language and politics. He received a 4-year Belgian National Fund for Scientific Research grant, exploring discourses of state reforms in Belgium, a country which we know is divided in terms of official languages. And this led to a number of publications, including the edited volume Variation in Political Metaphor. Today, Dr. Perez will deliver the lecture Metaphor Studies as a Bridge Between Linguistics and Political Science, Theoretical Implications and Methodological Challenges. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for this really nice presentation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here, and I would really like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my work here in this forum. And so I will present, as Patrick said, the interdisciplinary research I've been conducting with a team of political scientists on the use of metaphors in political discourse. Before I start, I would also like to publicly congratulate the organizers for this very nice conference, which they had to organize in under difficult circumstances. So really, thank you very much to all of you. So today I would like to talk about, in the introduction, about the role of metaphors in human cognition. I will also briefly discuss metaphors in political discourse from a more theoretical perspective. And then in the third part of this talk, I would like to present 3 case studies I've been conducting together with my colleagues on citizen discourse, on media discourse, and on institutional discourse. Let's get started. In his 2012 book, James Jerry indicated that English speakers uttered about 1 metaphor for every 10 to 25 words, or about 6 metaphors a minute. These ratios highlight the very pervasive role metaphor plays in language. And since the work of Lakoff and Johnson in the 1980s, we also know that metaphors are recognized as a key component of human cognition, a key component which guides our perception and understanding of abstract concepts. At the conceptual level, metaphor consists of a mapping between 2 conceptual domains. We could see this mapping as a set of systematic associations between these domains, as represented between this figure, which comes from Landau and colleagues. And in fact, more specifically, we have a knowledge structure from a source domain, which are transferred and mapped onto a target domain. And in this way, the conceptual metaphor allows people to draw on their knowledge of the source as a framework for thinking about the target. According to conceptual metaphor theory, the source domain generally pertains to the to our concrete experience of the world. And we rely on this experience of the world to understand and structure abstract domains, such as love, for example. In this example, this is a very classical example of how the abstract domain of love can be structured by the source domain of journeys, for example. A very important point also regarding metaphorical mappings is that the same target domain can be structured by different mappings, by different source domains. And this is really important for political discourse analysis, because the choice of a source domain is most of the time very relevant to describe a given political concept, as we will see in a few minutes. Okay. Given their frequency and the role they play on our understanding of abstract concepts that structure our everyday life and social interactions, the study of metaphors has reached out to many other scientific disciplines among cognitive and social sciences, but not only. Just to give us a quick and brief overview, for example, we know that metaphors have been discussed in philosophy, for example, raising questions about how metaphors can shape our experience of reality, or the role they play on structuring our understanding of concepts such as rationality, for example. Metaphors have also been studied a lot in communication science, for example, for their potential to structure all kinds of concepts, for example, like economy or environment or morality. They have also been studied in education, for example, for their potential of scientific popularization. As we probably all are learners of foreign languages, well, metaphors have also been used in this field, for example, to foster vocabulary acquisition and transfer from DL1 or DL2. More in line with the theme of this conference, metaphors have also been studied in, for example, social sciences, where they can structure our perception of concepts such as society. I'd like to point out the work by Rigney in 2001, for example. He described how different metaphors could relate to different visions on the society and also relate to different ideologies regarding the organization of societies. Conceptual metaphors are also important in the way we construct our identity. This has been shown, for example, by Wilson and Hay for a question relating to the social identity. In this regard, I would like to mention the work of a colleague from the University of Liège, who has studied the role of metaphors in the processes of identity constructions at a discursive level, identity construction processes of language minority groups in Belgium. But metaphors can also play a role in the construction of national identity, supranational identity, of notions such as citizenship, which has been shown by Jakub Filonik for ancient Greece, for example. Yesterday, we heard a very interesting talk on how metaphors were processed. So this is more related to psycholinguistics and psychology. In psychology, metaphors are also important because they have relations with emotions, but they also realize or explicit how our cognition can be embodied. Metaphors have also been used in brain studies to show how they establish neural relationships between different zones of the brain, but also in health care discourse, for example. Dennis Tai has shown how metaphor could be useful in psychotherapy, and you are also probably aware of the work of Elena Semino and her team, who have worked on the use of metaphors in treatments against cancer. And of course, as you probably will guess from the title of this presentation, metaphors have also been studied a lot in political science and in political discourse. And this will be the topic of the second part of this introduction. It is often claimed that Aristotle was the first to point to the usefulness of metaphors in politics. For example, in his Poetics, he claimed that metaphor, that the mastery of metaphor was the greatest thing by far, and that metaphor mastery was a sign of genius. More recently, well, 30 years ago, which is recent if we compare that to Aristotle period, Lakov revived this study of metaphors in political science, for example, by underlining the very, he revived the interest of conceptual metaphors for an understanding of politics with this opening sentence of his famous article, 91 article, in which he decoded and also denounced the metaphorical narrative that was used by the US authorities to justify the war in Iraq. Since then, since the 90s, a lot of works have been published on metaphors in political discourse. Think, for example, of Lakov's Moral Politics in '96, in which he discusses two conceptual models of morality which structure the way liberals and conservatives think about political issues. Andreas Musolf has also worked a lot on political discourses, metaphors in political discourses and debates about the European construction. He designed in 2016 the notion of metaphor scenario, which referred to recurring argumentative, narrative, and stance-taking patterns in discourse analysis. And he gives, for example, the metaphor of the heart of Europe, which is a metaphor which has been used a lot in the discourse about EU integration in the UK for 20 years. And he shows, for example, how this metaphor has been reused by supporters of the Brexit campaign, who pointed at the rotten heart of Europe. And he shows, in fact, how this metaphor of the heart of Europe has been structuring the discourse about EU relationships between the EU and the UK for 25 years. Other works that could be mentioned are the works by Goatley in 2007, who highlighted the function of metaphors that can carry on, that can vehicle, ideologies, and also the work of Jonathan Chartres Black, who analyzed a lot of speeches of major UK and US politicians, applying critical discourse analysis, but with a special attention for metaphor, which led him to develop his critical metaphor analysis approach. And for him, metaphor are really important because beyond their role on our conceptualization of abstract concepts, they can contribute to miscreation, as he states in this quote, because they activate unconscious emotional associations. And also, he suggests that the politicians who master metaphor, well, in fact, will occupy, will take the power in occupying the mind of the public opinion. If we summarize the importance of metaphors in political discourse, I think we can point to two main directions. The first is that metaphor structure our perception and understanding of abstract political concepts and relations. Think, for example, of political systems such as federalism, think of democracy, concepts such as nation or nationalism. All these concepts cannot be understood without metaphors. And metaphors make these concepts accessible, in fact. The second reason why metaphors are so interesting in political discourse is that they have the potential to frame the debate. Framing has been defined by Ant-Man as selecting some aspects of a perceived reality and making it more salient in a communicating text in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and or treatment recommendation for the described item. So this is this function I was referring to in the beginning, and the fact that we can choose the source domain to talk about a particular political issue, and that choosing will imply, for example, manipulating in a way the political representation one could have about this particular issue. And this is also what Musolf is suggesting, as he states that political metaphor primarily serve as a means to change meanings and to change social and political attitudes. Okay, from this discussion, we could get the idea that everything has been done in political metaphor research. And luckily, that's not the case. In fact, what remains to be done is to, I think, is to focus more on the potential effect of metaphors. What is their role? Why are they different than just simple other word forms, for example? And to discuss the potential effect of metaphors, I think it's relevant to make a distinction between two lines of research, which I will call production and reception. And I'm not the only one to call them like that, but with production, I'm just referring to semiotic analyses of political discourse, which aim at identifying metaphor in discourse, in natural political discourse, and which also aims at categorizing these metaphors, regrouping them into larger scenarios, for example, and trying to see how these metaphors can contribute to vehicle some ideologies. And the effect of metaphors, according to this line of research, is an indirect effect or an assumed effect thanks to the effect of discourse itself. Another way to look at the impact of metaphors is to design behavioral analysis of how metaphor can impact or influence the citizens' mental representations. Under which conditions can metaphors have an impact on political representations? We are talking here about really experimental settings then. And in the research project we have been conducting with my colleagues from political science department, we focused on both kinds of research lines, namely production and reception. We have designed a series of experiments aiming at measuring the role of metaphors on shaping political representations. But unfortunately, I won't have the time today to discuss them because I would like to focus on the production side of our research by presenting 3 different studies we have been conducting on the use of metaphors in different kinds of political discourses. So I would like to present these 3 case studies, but before I do that, I would like to briefly discuss with you some avenues for future research on political metaphor use, and more precisely, how can we go beyond the simple and taking care of I mean simple with quotation marks, sorry, observation that political discourse is structured by metaphor, such as language is, in fact, and beyond the simple observation that if we look at political discourse, we will find metaphors. Okay, this is something we know, but how can we go further than that? What can we learn about political metaphors? And this is, in fact, the main issues that we discuss under the label variation or volume variation in political metaphor. It was published, it was edited, that I co-edited with my colleagues Mine Rochon and Paul Thibaudot. And we think that variation is the way forward in political metaphor analysis. And by variation, we mean different types of variation. The first type of variation we are thinking of is looking at different types of metaphors in political discourse. And I will explain this in a moment. Another way to go forward is to look at different types of political discourses. And lastly, to look at how different political actors use metaphors in different political contexts. Let's start with the different types of metaphors in political discourse. And before I get into theoretical notion, perhaps I should start with this example. You have the French text and the translation into English, and this is an instance of the conceptual metaphor. Organization is physical structure, or political systems are buildings. On the left-hand side, we see a quite conventional metaphor. I believe it's a problem which is typical of the difficulty of constructing a federal state. Here, this is a metaphorical use of the verb construct. This is also a very conventional metaphor because this is simply the way to say it. Okay? So this is a metaphor that has been lexicalized, that has been conventionalized in language use. If we compare this example to the example on the right-hand side, well, we see something different happening here with the same domain. Here we have a politician just stating that it's impossible to build a house if the architect is changing the plans every week. And this is a direct attack at the prime minister. Here we get the feeling that this politician wanted to produce a metaphor to reach a particular rhetorical or pragmatic effect. And this is what we want to do when we say that we want to look at different types of metaphors. We want to distinguish the metaphors that are instances of language use, figurative language use, from the metaphors that have been used deliberately. What this means, I mean, there has been a lot of debate about the word deliberate here, but I mean, which has been used intentionally by a politician to achieve a particular communicative goal. And so we think it's really relevant for political discourse analysis to make this distinction between deliberate metaphors. So this is a notion that has been developed by Gerard Steen from the University of Amsterdam. And he defines these deliberate metaphors are metaphors that are meant to change the addressee's perspective on the referent or topic that is the target of the metaphor by making the addressee look at it from a different conceptual domain or space, which functions as a conceptual source. So these deliberate metaphors are metaphors that are used as metaphors to achieve a particular communicative goal. And these metaphors are probably the metaphors that will make it possible to change meanings and political attitudes, but this remains, of course, to be researched. A second way to develop or to study variation, in political discourse analysis is to look at different types of political discourses. And this observation comes from discussions with political scientists. And in fact, when you discuss with political scientists, you realize that they are not so much interested in political discourse. And in fact, political discourse has been studied a lot in linguistic research from various theoretical and methodological perspectives. But oddly enough, political scientists do not seem to care. And this has been suggested, for example, by Van Dijk in 1907, when he claims that most scholars doing political discourse analysis are linguists or discourse analysts, or when he states that, for example, when we consider the use or application of discourse approaches in political science, we find that it is one of the few social sciences that so far have barely been infected by the modern viruses of the study of text and talk, with a beautiful metaphor. And in fact, if we take a closer look at the notion of political discourse, well, in fact, it is often presented as a global and Korean genre, but in fact, it shows a very high degree of variation. Just to give you a couple of examples, here, political discourse is operationalized as parliamentary debate. Here, we're talking about parliamentary apologies, or political religious discourse, or diplomatic condolences, or posters, tweets, of course, of President Trump. Here, it's not really clear, but we're talking about citizen letters to editors of a newspaper. And here, even graffiti on the separation wall at Abu Dis are considered as political discourse. So you see that political discourse can refer to a lot of different things. And in fact, this is in line with the very definition of political discourse or politics in general. We have two or more different ways to look at politics. We can think of politics in terms of institutions. So in this case, political discourse is discourse that is produced in a political institution by a professional political actor. But in fact, political discourse of politics can also be achieved by men and women who resolve conflicts, for example, in everyday life, who manage power relationships in their everyday life. So the question is, do we have to be a politician to produce political discourse? To get a grip on this notion of political discourse, we conducted a bibliometric analysis together with my colleagues, focusing on the keyword political discourse, which we analyze in 165 scientific articles, which you see there. And we used a series of variables, such as, for example, who is the political actor, what kind of medium, is it oral discourse or written discourse, geographic coverage, and so on, and so on. And from this analysis, we could observe that when linguists talk about political discourse, they mainly talk about institutional discourse. Oral discourse, very often they analyze speeches, for example, or debates. And there is also an over-representation of elite discourse. So this means that the discourses that are analyzed are discourses by professional politicians. And in fact, there is in linguistic research from this study, we can conclude that there is little attention for other genres, such as media discourse about political issue or citizen discourse. But we think that broadening the scope of political discourse analysis and including other types of discourses could reveal different patterns of metaphor use, for example, and could also give more information about how a particular metaphor scenario can circulate in a given discourse community. And a last type of variation that we want to look at is looking at different types of political actors. And the question here is, do all political actors use metaphors in the same way and to the same extent? Or are there variables, for example, such as political affiliation or gender, that could contribute to different metaphor usages? And the second question related to political actors is, For what rhetorical purposes do they use metaphors in a particular context? Okay, enough introductions. Oh, sorry, I still have one very little introduction. Although Thomas did very well in the introduction, I should say a few words about Belgian federalism because that's what I am going to talk about. So, if you don't know, Belgium is, sorry, here between France and the Netherlands and Germany, at the heart of Europe, one could say. The political system in Belgium is quite complicated, although it is a small country. We have 7 different governments and parliaments. We have one federal national authority. And then we have 3 communities, basically representing the different languages that are spoken in Belgium. So Dutch in the north, French in the south, and German in the east, eastern part. And we also have 3 regions dealing with other matters than the communities. And of course, the interesting thing about Belgium from a political perspective is to study the process of political transformation from one unitary country before 1970 to a federal country. And this process of federalization has been achieved through 6 state reforms, respectively in 1970, 80, 88, 93, 2001, and 2013. And basically, I won't go into details, but the different entities have different views on how the state should work and what its future is. And as often is the case, money is also at the center of the problems because some parts are richer than others, to put it really simply. I hope that I don't have any fellow Belgian citizen in the virtual room who could disagree with my very basic analysis of the political situation in Belgium, but I think it's important for you to have these basic notions before we get into the analysis of specific kinds of discourses. Let's start with citizen discourse. We think that looking at political discourse can be really relevant, for example, to explore the citizens' sorry, I'll just quote it fully, because in line with Bauer 2012, we think that metaphor can be an interesting reasoning tool for citizens to see how they perceive particular political notions and concepts. From a political point of view, this can also be relevant, for example, because with the rise of social networks, citizens can become more visible political actors. And there is a tendency also in the Western politics towards more and more deliberative democracy. So letting the citizens express themselves on the future of given of particular political issues. From a linguistic perspective, this is also interesting because we can see through metaphor use how citizens understand and perceive particular political issues. And we can also see how, for example, political discourse echoes in citizens' representations. For example, this has also been stated by DeCilia and colleagues in 1999 when they claimed that citizen data enable one to study the recontextualization and transformation of specific political concepts and identity narrative expressed by politicians, taught in educational systems, promoted in mass media, and which are expressed in everyday situations and interactions. So this is, let's say, the perspective with which we tackle citizen discourse. For this study, the main question was quite simple, namely, do citizens use metaphors when talking about Belgian federalism? And if yes, what type of metaphors and which source domains do they use to talk about these metaphors? And also, are there cultural differences between the groups? Because we collected data in the French-speaking part and the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium. The data consists of focus group discussions coming from 2 citizens panels held in Liège and Antwerp in 2008. And the citizens were, in fact, prompted to talk about topics related to Belgian federalism. We recorded everything and transcribed the discussions, and this resulted in 2 corpora, which have consequently been analyzed. We applied, in fact, a semi-automatic method for metaphor identification using, in fact, the target domain of Belgian federalism. So we concentrated on a list of keywords that could refer to the Belgian state, and we analyzed all the contexts in which these keywords did appear. This resulted in about 1,000 examples for the 2 corpora, examples of potential metaphorical context, and these potential metaphorical contexts were then analyzed manually using 2 complementary procedures, namely the MIP procedure, which is the standard procedure to identify metaphor in discourse. And this was complemented by the MIP-VU procedure, which is the same as MIP, but VU stands for Vrije Universiteit, so the Free University of Amsterdam. And this refers, in fact, to an identification method to identify deliberate metaphors. To identify these deliberate metaphors, we applied a top-down approach. And basically, this consists of analyzing the context of in which the metaphor is produced to find, for example, wordplay or an explicit rhetorical effect or signaling of metaphor, and so on and so on. So these are contextual cues of deliberate metaphor use. Getting to the results, we observe, so I told you we analyze about 500 examples in each corpus, and most of these examples turned out to be non-metaphorical, and the metaphorical contexts that were relevant for this were, there were 1999 relevant contexts in the French-speaking corpus and 75 in the Dutch-speaking corpus. If we look at the, and I will ask you just to concentrate on the right-hand side of the graph, the deliberate and the non-deliberate metaphor, what do we see? In fact, quite similar patterns for both groups, namely higher frequency of deliberate metaphors in the corpus of French-speaking citizens, but this is not significant. Okay, but we see that between 22 and 32% of the metaphors that we identified were deliberate metaphors. But what's more interesting when focusing on these 2 types of metaphors is to look at the different domains the different source domains, sorry, namely the non-deliberate metaphors appear with domains that are in fact quite conventional when talking about politics. We are thinking of machine, we're thinking of destinations, of personification, the construction domain. Think of that example I showed you a couple of minutes ago. So these are, let's say, domains in terms of which we make sense of political concepts in general. If we look at the deliberate metaphors, we see that one of the most prominent domains in which deliberate metaphors appear is the family domain. Family, broadly interpreted, also including relationships, love relationships. And so what we see here is that making this distinction between deliberate and non-deliberate metaphors makes it possible to see that the traditional domains are appear with non-deliberate metaphors, whereas deliberate metaphors are combined with domains that make it possible for citizens, for example, to give their understanding and opinion about how the state is working. I'll give you just a couple of examples. So this is a machine metaphor, which is like a basic metaphor for political discourse. And when citizens use this metaphor, they refer to the fact that the state is not working, that it's artificial, that it's very complex. And this is just an instance of non-deliberate metaphor. And the very important deliberate metaphor is a metaphor related to love relationships, where different entities of the federal system are considered as lovers, engaged in a complicated relationship. As you can see here, for example, if we compare this to a couple, some couples get married under a wedding contract and so on. Interestingly, this metaphor of the love relationship makes it possible for the citizens, for example, to really to express different ideas and visions about the future of Belgian federalism. Here you see a discussion between two citizens about the fact that Belgium is an arranged marriage, for example, for the better or for the worse. And the one is just claiming, well, this is an arranged marriage, so we should end it. And the other is saying, yeah, okay, but in a marriage there are good times and bad times, and so we should keep it. So this metaphor is really important in structuring the way in which citizens make sense of the relationships between the different entities of the Belgian state. Okay, so basically from this study, we concluded that there were no big cultural differences between the groups. So the French-speaking citizen, the Dutch-speaking citizen behave basically in the same way. And deliberate metaphors were really relevant for the study of the metaphors in terms of which the citizens make sense of Belgian federalism. I will now move to the second case study, which I would like to discuss with you. And this case study is a case study concentrating on television debates. This time we are talking about a diachronic study based on the collection of television data. And this diachronic study wanted to concentrate on the progressive transformation of Belgium's political system from a unitary system to a federal system. And we wanted to study that in a corpus of political debates throughout the process. More specifically, we wanted to study which metaphorical frames were used to describe Belgian federalism, to what extent this evolved through time, and also to what extent different political actors produced which type of metaphors. The corpus consisted of 80 debates in total. For this presentation, we had more than 120 debates in total if we take the Dutch speaking data into account, but so far we have only analyzed the French speaking data. And these television debates are weekly political programs which are broadcasted by the public TV channel. And the period covered is the period from 1967 until 2016. And the corpus for the French-speaking part consisted of a bit more than 900,000 words. Interestingly, this corpus includes different types of political actors, Belgian politicians, obviously, from both communities, from different entities, but also journalists and also regularly members of the civil society. The audience, we have two different types of audience, namely a primary audience consisting of the other political actors during the debates, and a secondary audience, of course, which are the citizens watching the television. For the analysis, we globally perform the same type of analysis as the one presented in the citizen data, with a nuance, namely the fact that we didn't achieve the analysis of all the metaphorical frames we wanted to analyze. So we have analyzed so far 60% of the data set by focusing on the four major metaphorical frames of conceptual frames, which were the battle frame, the disease frame, the construction frame, and the relationships frame. So to be very clear about how we did this, we have what we call onomatological profiles for each frame. That is a list of words relating to that frame. And we search for these words in the corpus, and then we analyze the output manually to just keep the relevant passages with metaphors. Again, we applied the MIPFU procedure, and we coded each instance of metaphors with external parameters, including political actor, gender, date, time, so as to be able to see how metaphor use was evolving. I'll just give you roughly the main tendencies of this second case study before getting to the conclusion. As you can see, we had in total about 5,800 potential metaphorical contexts after the semi-automatic phase, and roughly half of it were confirmed as metaphorical context. And then we checked to what extent the metaphors we had found related to Belgian federalism, because it can be that these metaphors have nothing to do with politics or with Belgian federalism. From these 2,000 metaphors, 9% turned out to be deliberate metaphors, so which is in fact in line with findings from other studies about deliberate metaphor use in other genres than the political genre. If we look at the relationship between deliberate and non-deliberate metaphors, well, we see that again, the non-deliberate metaphors are much more frequent than the deliberate metaphors, except for one domain frame, namely the relationships frame. And this is interesting because this is in a way similar to what we found in the citizen data. I'll also just show you a very last two graphs to conclude before turning to the discussion. This is a graph which shows the variation of metaphor over time. And we've tried to map this onto the political context to see if a rise in metaphor use could be explained by a particular political situation. And in fact, this is difficult to make sense of all these results in terms of, for example, elections or state reforms. The only thing that is interesting is that one of the peaks in metaphor use just appeared in the middle of a very long crisis, institutional crisis in Belgium. So perhaps there is a link, but we have to study this in more detail, between time of crisis and the use of metaphor. This is a hypothesis that we would like to test further. Okay, I will now just roughly go to conclusions. And for the conclusions, I wanted to stress two things. The first one is the notion of interdisciplinarity, because that's one of the, it's not the theme of the conference, but it's one of the important aspects the conference will tackle. And I hope I've been able to show you that metaphors are really relevant for interdisciplinary study. And I wanted also to look back at my collaboration with political scientists for the last 10 years, just to say what I've learned from this collaboration. Namely, for me as a linguist, working with political scientists was really fruitful, because it helped me go beyond the fascination for metaphors and language. As linguists, we could find that a given expression or metaphor is really beautiful. And so working with political scientists helped me to go further than that in trying to understand why metaphors can make the difference. It helped me also question aspects of metaphor studies that I could have taken for granted otherwise. And I think this collaboration with linguists for political scientists was also relevant because they then realized that words and word forms were also important when studying discourse, because they have the tendency to only focus on the content, on ideas behind the words, but by focusing on metaphors, well, of course, they have understood that it plays a really important role on the way we structure political concepts, but also that a metaphor instead of another can make the difference. And for the rest, just thank you for your attention. I would like also to thank my team, my colleagues, and I'm just waiting for potential questions, comments.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. And yes, we do have a good probably 10 minutes for questions. So if you would like to ask a question, you can do so in the chat and I will read out the question, or you can raise your hand. Perhaps I could start, and in the meantime, other participants will maybe say something in the chat. But it was quite interesting to see that there didn't seem to be any differences in terms of the French versus the Dutch-speaking parts of Belgium, because yes, and generally this sort of citizen discourse, for me at least, is maybe the most interesting avenue here, because there is definitely a sort of top-down bias in political discourse studies, where politicians are analyzed more than the common people sort of who do discuss politics. So it was interesting to see that there didn't seem to be any differences in metaphor use between the two, the speakers of the two languages. But I noticed in your sort of map of Belgium that Brussels is basically treated as a separate element of the country, sort of outside either the French or the Dutch speaking parts of the country. Would you think, or has this been a factor in your research, that Brussels as a sort of hub of European politics, a place where also I would guess English is a very important language, that there could be differences between the sort of Brussels area and either of the two parts of the country?
Yes, we excluded citizens from Brussels from the panels because of what you just mentioned. Brussels is a very problematic case in Belgium, because it's on the one hand it's the capital of Europe, as you mentioned, or as you know, but also it is part of Flanders, but it is an autonomous region with its own autonomy, but it's located within the boundary of Flanders. And if we take the language into account, Brussels is bilingual, so there are just Dutch-speaking citizens and also French-speaking citizens, along with the international community there. So This is a really special case, and we didn't want to involve citizens from Brussels to avoid bias, in fact.
Right, thank you. And we have a question in the chat from Professor Pavelchik. Thanks so much for the wonderful talk. Can you elaborate a bit more on the hypothetical link, as you said, that is the more difficult crisis-like situation, the more politicians draw on metaphors? The more, yeah.
Yes. This is really at this stage working hypothesis, so we would have to check this also with other data, which I didn't have the time to present, but coming from institutional discourse, so parliamentary debates. We also observed there a rise in metaphor, in fact, in deliberate metaphor use in times of crisis. And the slide I showed wasn't perhaps that clear about that, but it was this one, was a peak at the time of political crisis, and the next slide is a slide, it's the same slide, in fact, with the distinction between non-deliberate metaphors in blue and deliberate metaphors in orange.
Oh, so we cannot see the slide if you are, showing something right now. Yeah.
Oh yeah, because I stopped sharing my screen, of course. I don't know if it's relevant to show it. Perhaps I can do it very quickly. So this is the second slide I wanted to present, which is the same as the first, but with this distinction between deliberate metaphors and non-deliberate metaphors. And here we see, in fact, a clear link between periods of crisis here in blue, and here also. So BHV crisis and more than 500 days without governments. These are two peaks in metaphor use, and also peaks in the extent to which deliberate metaphors have been used. And this is a pattern that we have found also in institutional discourse. And that's why we have this hypothesis, but we need more data to be able to confirm this. For example, for the the television debates corpus, we also have data from Flanders, which we didn't analyze so far, but which we will in the coming months. So perhaps this will confirm this tendency.
Thank you. We have a question from Professor Fabiszak. Thank you for the interesting lecture. I have a question for clarification. At some point, you said that media discourse is analyzed less by the linguists than institutional discourse. Wodak makes a distinction between discourse about something, about climate change, political discourse, and discourse by politicians, by journalists, by citizens. Maybe then the keyword you used for bibliometrics analysis skewed the results towards institutional rather than media discourse.
Thank you very much. This is a good suggestion. But I guess so. We to find the relevant articles. Well, I was talking about 164 articles, I think, but there were more articles in the first stages of the bibliometric analysis. I think if the abstract contained either the word political, either discourse, it would have we would have selected the article or pre-selected the article. So I guess this could reduce the potential bias you are talking about, but I should check. But this is a nice suggestion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we have two more questions in the chat. From Professor Berzelli. Very interesting talk. Thank you. Did you look at metaphors for languages? I have done this in Swiss policy discourse and found things like tie, key, soul, wall, etc. Same in Belgium?
I don't know. We haven't done this, but this is really interesting avenues as well for data.
Thank you. And I suppose the final question from Tomasz Dyrmo. Do you distinguish different levels of analysis in terms of domains versus frames, versus perhaps image schemas? Thank you very much for an interesting talk.
No, well, we didn't go that far in the analysis, but I'm just wondering about the relevance of image schemas here. Perhaps, Thomas, could you be more explicit about this?
If I may.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because I've noted that you categorized container as a domain, and I was curious whether you would consider container as an image schema, or rather a domain in terms of mappings between two domains in conceptual metaphors.
In fact, we had sometimes, I must admit, some trouble finding a good name to put different metaphors in, and container was in fact a name for different types of metaphors. For example, we had sometimes Belgium is a laboratorium, or Belgium is an empty an empty box without anything in it, so that's artificial. So we use the term container to refer to these uses. But I realize with your comments that was perhaps not a good idea. We should have preferred another term to avoid this confusion with the image schemas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, perhaps one more quick question from the chat. Many thanks for the talk. Can you tell us something more about the role of disease metaphor in political discourse? Any characteristic contexts?
What we observed is that the disease metaphor is used in citizen data, but more frequently by the Dutch-speaking citizens with a negative, very negative view on Belgian federalism. And it has also been used in the media discourse, so in the television debates, to talk about more potential solutions for given institutional problems. But so these are different political actors. The politicians tend to use the disease either as the citizens, so to denote a very negative situation, but they also use the disease domain, but I mean broadly interpreted, also to talk about potential medicine to find solutions to these problems, whereas the citizens are very negative when they use this disease domain.
Thank you. Right, that concludes this session. Thank you once again to our plenary speaker, and thank you for all your questions. We now have a short coffee break, after which we will continue with our thematic sessions in just about 25 minutes. So thank you and see you.
Thank you very much.